The heavy oak doors of St. Augustine's creaked open as I stepped into the dimly lit sanctuary. Even in death, the silence of a church felt weightier, like a presence pressing down on my shoulders. The air smelled faintly of candle wax and something more acrid, smoke. I'm Detective Ethan Cole, and I've seen my fair share of crime scenes, but this one felt different. Maybe it was the way the stained glass windows caught the morning light, casting fractured rainbows onto the floor. Or maybe it was the body slumped in the confessional, slashes of red staining his white clerical collar. Father Jonathan Reeves had been the heart of this community. By all accounts, he was charismatic, compassionate, the kind of man who'd remember your name after meeting you once. But as I examined the scene, it became clear that someone saw him differently. Someone hated him enough to leave him dead in his own sanctuary. "What do we have?" I asked Officer Ramirez, who stood near the altar, her face grim. Male, mid-40s. Looks like blunt force trauma to the back of the head. No sign of forced entry. The janitor found him this morning when he came to clean. Ramirez gestured toward the confessional. And then there's this. Inside the confessional booth, a Bible lay open on the floor, its pages charred and curling at the edges. Next to it was a plain white envelope, its contents spilling out, $100 bills neatly stacked. I crouched down, careful not to disturb anything, and used a pen to nudge the envelope. There had to be at least $5,000 here. A priest with a cash stash? That's not part of the usual liturgy, I muttered. Ramirez smirked faintly but didn't comment. Her eyes darted toward a woman sitting in one of the pews, her hands trembling as she clutched a rosary. "Witness?" I asked. "Sort of. That's Mrs. Callahan. She was here late last night, said she came in to pray. Claims she heard muffled voices coming from the confessional around midnight, but didn't see anyone." I straightened up and approached Mrs. Callahan. Her face was pale, her eyes puffy from crying. "Mrs. Callahan, I'm Detective Cole. Can you tell me more about what you heard?" She looked up at me, her rosary clutched tighter. It was just voices. Low, like they didn't want to be overheard. At first, I thought Father Jonathan was counseling someone, but then it got heated. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was angry. I didn't want to intrude, so I left. "Did you see anyone else in the church?" She shook her head. "No, just Father Jonathan when I arrived. He smiled at me, as he always did. I can't believe he's gone." I nodded, offering what I hoped was a comforting expression. "Thank you. If you think of anything else, no matter how small, please let us know." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks as she returned her gaze to the crucifix above the altar. Back near the confessional, the forensics team was getting to work. Ramirez approached me, her phone in hand. "You'll want to see this," she said, showing me a photo. It was a close-up of the burned Bible. Beneath the charred pages, faint but visible, was a handwritten note. The fire hadn't consumed it entirely. "What does it say?" I asked, leaning in. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." Ramirez's voice was flat, but her eyes betrayed her unease. I frowned, my mind racing. A burned Bible, a stack of cash, a cryptic note, and now a witness who heard angry voices. It was too much and not enough all at once. "We'll need to look into Father Jonathan's finances," I said. "If he had this much cash lying around, there's a reason. And people don't usually kill priests without one hell of a motive." As Ramirez called in the request, I took another look at the scene. The open Bible, the blood-streaked confessional, the fractured light filtering through the stained glass. Whoever had done this had turned a place of peace into something unrecognizable. And if Mrs. Callahan was right about those voices, then Father Jonathan's final moments had been anything but silent. I didn't know it then, but the trail I was about to follow would unravel more than just a murder. It would expose secrets that had been festering beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect parish, secrets that someone had killed to keep hidden. The forensics team buzzed quietly around the scene as I stepped out into the crisp January air, trying to think. The neighborhood surrounding St. Augustine's was quiet, its quaint brick row houses still waking up. Yet beneath that calm facade, I knew the church wasn't the only thing hiding sins. "Detective Cole," Ramirez called out from behind me. "You're going to want to take a look at this." I turned to see her holding a small evidence bag. Inside was a silver key, slightly tarnished, with a worn leather tag that read Rectory. "Found it tucked under the edge of the confessional seat," she said. "Doesn't match any doors in the main church." I nodded. "Let's see where it fits." The rectory was attached to the church, a modest brick structure that served as the pastor's living quarters and office. As Ramirez and I stepped inside, the faint smell of incense lingered, but it did little to cover the musty air. The living room was small but tidy, with stacks of theology books on every available surface. A mug sat on the coffee table, its contents congealed, a reminder that Father Jonathan had started a day he'd never finish. We found the locked drawer in his desk. The key slid in easily, and as it clicked open, Ramirez exhaled sharply. Inside was another stack of cash, this one thicker than the envelope in the confessional. Beneath it were bank statements, all in Father Jonathan's name, showing large deposits over the past 6 months. The source? Anonymous donations. Doesn't look like church funds, Ramirez said, frowning. No, it doesn't. I scanned the statements again, my mind piecing things together. He was skimming, laundering it through anonymous donations, and keeping the surplus here. But why burn a Bible? Ramirez asked. It's dramatic. Sends a message. Maybe the killer wanted to make a statement, I said. Or maybe it was personal. I flipped through the remaining papers, looking for something, anything, that would connect the dots. Near the bottom of the drawer was a torn piece of paper with a handwritten note. Meet me tonight. Midnight. Confessional. This just got more interesting, I muttered, holding it up for Ramirez to see. He had a meeting planned. The same time Mrs. Callahan heard those voices. Ramirez shook her head, her expression dark. And the meeting didn't end well. By late afternoon, we had a clearer picture of Father Jonathan's financial misdeeds, but no suspects. Parishioners we interviewed painted him as a saint. Yet, the growing evidence told a different story, a man with secrets he couldn't keep buried forever. Then came the break. The forensics team found fingerprints on the burned Bible. They belonged to Michael Denton, a longtime parishioner and former member of the church's finance committee. A quiet man, known for his devotion but also his short temper. Ramirez and I drove to his modest home on the outskirts of town, a sinking feeling settling in my gut. Michael answered the door with an uneasy smile, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the frame. His graying hair was disheveled, his eyes darting between Ramirez and me. Detectives, he said, his voice tight. What's this about? We need to ask you a few questions about Father Jonathan, I said, stepping inside as Ramirez flashed her badge. The mention of the priest's name made him flinch. He gestured toward the living room, where we sat on an old couch that sagged in the middle. Michael, I began, keeping my tone steady, we found your fingerprints on a burned Bible at the crime scene. Can you explain how they got there? His face drained of color. I don't know what you're talking about. I leaned forward. Father Jonathan was found dead in the confessional last night. We have witnesses who heard an argument. We have evidence tying you to the scene. This is your chance to tell us the truth. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, like a dam breaking, the words spilled out. He was stealing, Michael said, his voice shaking. Taking money from the church, from us. I found out months ago. Tried to confront him, but he brushed me off, said it was for the church's good. And last night, I pressed. Michael's hands twisted in his lap. I met him in the confessional. Told him he had to stop, that I'd go to the diocese if I had to. He laughed at me. Said no one would believe me over him. His eyes welled up with tears. I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to understand what he was doing. I pushed him and he fell. Hit his head. The fire. I panicked. Thought if I burned the Bible, it'd look like someone else. A hate crime, maybe. Ramirez and I exchanged a glance. It wasn't premeditated, but it was still murder. Michael Denton, I said, standing, you're under arrest for the murder of Father Jonathan Reeves. As I cuffed him, the weight of the case settled on me. It was tragic all around. A man corrupted by greed, another consumed by desperation. St. Augustine's would recover, but the scars would linger, etched in its stained glass light and whispered prayers. The ride back to the precinct was quiet. Michael sat in the back seat, his head bowed, murmuring under his breath. At first, I thought it was guilt, but as I listened closer, I realized he was praying. I didn't interrupt. Maybe he needed forgiveness for what he'd done, but it wasn't my job to give it to him. That was between him and a higher power, if there was one. Back at my desk, I went through the final pieces of the case. The confession sealed it, and the evidence backed up Michael's story. He'd acted out of anger and desperation, but in the end, a man was still dead, and no amount of justification could bring him back. The press had already caught wind of the murder, and the story would likely dominate the headlines for weeks. Beloved priest killed in confessional, parishioner arrested in shock twist. It was the kind of case that left people talking, whispering, questioning. If you couldn't trust a man of God, who could you trust? I closed the file on Father Jonathan Reeves and leaned back in my chair. Cases like this always left me uneasy, not just because of the crime itself, but because of what they revealed about human nature. The line between right and wrong, saint and sinner, was thinner than we liked to admit. As I stared out the window at the city's skyline, the light from a distant church steeple caught my eye. It gleamed, proud and unyielding, as if nothing could touch it. But I knew better. Beneath every shining surface were cracks, waiting to split open. This case was done, but the questions it raised would linger. People would move on, as they always did. The parish would rebuild, new prayers would be whispered, and life would continue. But for me, it was another reminder that even in places of faith and peace, darkness could still take root. And in my line of work, it always found a way to bloom.